This lecture follows the end of the High Classical era and the beginning of the Late Classical, which corresponds with the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. The Late Classical era in general is going to follow the decline in Athenian dominance in the Greek or Athenian Empire and the rise of a new approach to the arts. This era is going to be marked by the end of the Peloponnesian War, with Sparta decisively defeating Athens, and will last until the death of Alexander the Great, when Greek hegemony and power will stretch across the largest empire the world has ever known, from Western Europe all the way to modern-day India. In the Peloponnesian War, we find that Athenian dominance is going to cause hostilities between them and the other city-states, specifically the militaristic Sparta, who are not accustomed to being told what to do by others. They go to war with Athens over a series of decades and eventually win this war. It is called the Peloponnesian War because it is primarily fought in the Peloponnesus, the southernmost area in the Greek mainland. Now we find that Athens is going to retain control of their maritime empire and trade, but are going to decline in political and military dominance. After a brutal set of wars, Athens eventually recovers their independence, but never again regains the dominant position in Greek civilization. They retained the reputation, however, as a center for artistic and intellectual life with the founding of the first academy or university. Now, we are going to see at this time the transition from the 5th century BCE Greek understanding of the universe during the 400s, when we have high classical sculpture such as the Doryphorus here being created, the Parthenon being built, showing us that humans impose order, or they believed could be imposed their order, on the universe surrounding them, and they could understand the world mathematically and intellectually. This is when they're going to be creating perfect statues using correct mathematical formulas for every bit of their decorative and mechanical efforts towards engineering feats like the Acropolis, and then of course understanding commensurability in statues like we see here. The standards of Phidias and Polykleitos, these great sculptors from the classical era, are going to focus on ideal proportions and idealized forms, trying to show the most perfect human form that could possibly exist, because the perfect individual is God-like. This will give way in the late classical era, from 400 to 323 BCE, to an abandonment of this ennobled, calm detachment. We find that now we will be focusing on the emotional, the expressive, and storytelling narratives. And we find that all of the elements we're going to be discussing now draw us in because they all relate to us on a very human scale, on a very human level. This is when we find humanizing forms of gods and men alike, of fully nude women finally. That is no surprise that they're going to evolve and develop at a time in which the emotional approach to things is going to be the primary motive and vehicle. In 387 BCE, at the same time, Plato founds a school outside of Athens. His student Aristotle did the same thing and later taught the Alexander of Macedon, who would become Alexander the Great. Now, Macedonia to the north is going to be a very interesting political entity for the Greeks, for they are a border zone, a buffer between the West, the civilized, democratic West as they saw it, who is going to believe that intellect and that rationality are going to be dominant. A barrier between them and then the irrational, tyrannical Eastern cultures such as Persia. So we find that Macedonia speaks Greek, they worship the same gods, and they really want to join the same level of prestige as the rest of the Greek city-states. But they've been fighting barbarians for so long that the Greeks considered them almost barbaric themselves. This leaves open the state of affairs in the late classical era, whereby Athens and Sparta had been fighting for so long that Philip II, the king of Macedon, is able to use this to his advantage and conquer these various Greek city-states one at a time because they were not united any longer. At the Battle of Chaeronea, we find in 338 BCE, he defeats Athens and then rapidly conquers the other city-states. He is unfortunately assassinated in 336 BCE, leaving his own son, Alexander III, who was merely 20 years old at the time, in charge of this vast Greek empire. We find here that Alexander the Great is going to lead the Greek armies in a war of revenge and conquest against the Persians. Instead of punishing the Greeks for their supposed involvement in his father's death, he turns to them and relies on an old grudge that they feel, saying that they should attack Persia and punish them for the earlier wars brought on Greece, for when they sacked Athens, for when they killed tens of thousands of Greeks. And this works. The Greeks unite against a common threat. They defeat the Persians and in doing so conquer an empire that stretches from India to Egypt to, again, Greece in the west. The campaigns begin in Pella, moving over to the Ionian coast in Turkey, whereby we see the battle between the Greeks and the Persians leaves the king of Persia without an army, without an empire. They then continue marching south and conquer Egypt, where the priests at Karnak are going to call Alexander the Great a god, a son of Amun-Ra, that he begins boasting that he is as they continue throughout the Persian Empire, making it all the way to India, where Alexander the Great takes an arrow to the chest and his men refuse to go any further and they turn back. Now, while Alexander is spreading Greek culture, language, philosophy, religion throughout all of the known world, the style that develops must also be able to communicate to a vast array of peoples, of various tongues, ethnicities, nationalities, beliefs. And the easiest way to do that is through an emotional appeal. And that's what we find is developing here, which will become Hellenistic art, that being Greek art in this way. So here we have Praxiteles and his Aphrodite of Knidos from 350 to 340 BCE. It is a Roman marble copy after a Greek bronze original, and we can tell that because of the jutting section of marble from the hip of Aphrodite to the jug here, the Hydra vase. This is the first of a well-known sculptor to depict a fully nude woman, because before, this had been a sign of low class or character. There is nudity in Greek art before the late classical period with women. However, it's only in slaves and or those of the lowest class. Comparing this to how goddesses were shown in the classical age, we find that we are now entering a new phase of eroticism and of narrative storytelling. So nudity, as seen here on the left, is going to be seen in the same type of subject in which we find a woman has disrobed. We find that Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sex here on the right, is holding her garment, her peplos, with her left hand as she has draped it over this vase to carry water and is about to step into the bath, just as the girl on the left is about to do the same, and then she will sponge off. So in the late classical era, we find that the female nude is going to be developed at the same time as an emotional appeal in art in general. For the female nude is not looked upon rationally by men, but instead is going to elicit emotional and or sexual responses, which are not rational, not intellectual. And we can see in how we engage with the statues how this is different. The face, of course, in the standard central part for ancient Greek statues has a rather empathetic and vulnerable look on it, as we find the brows are parted as she stares, of course, down and out understanding her nudity and vulnerability because she begins to cover up. Now, as she is about to bathe in this contrapposto pose, she is going to be projecting her knee, pulling it around her body, almost shielding herself in this passively seductive way. We notice that she's emphasizing the forms of the thighs and the abdomen, the rounded nature of it. But because this is a late classical statue, she is shown as though in the process of an action, of doing something. There is a narrative here. The gesture, of course, draws attention to her nudity, just like, of course, the fact that she's holding her dress also shows that she was clothed. Now she has taken her clothes off and is shielding herself. This, of course, makes it even more erotic with this Venus Pudica pose, or a modest Venus pose, for it shows us there is something illicit that we are seeing. We are looking illicitly, almost in a voyeuristic fashion, because the woman knows that we should not be seeing her in this state. We know the effect that this had on men at the time was somewhat overwhelming. For Pliny, in his natural history again, the Roman historian, tells how some men were overcome with love, in that priests had to send more guards to this temple that it was seen in to make sure that men could not get to her at night, for they would leave stains of love on the statue. So the Cnidians, to show you how this was so appealing and how you would engage with the statue, placed this statue in an open shrine to be seen in the round in a Tholos temple. So we find that this statue is meant to be understood by walking around it. You engage with something that you walk around emotionally, sensually, physically. And so men actually masturbated on the statue. This is going to tell us how they would have engaged with this statue in what is now the area you can see in front of us, overlooking a coast. So sailors would park their vessels below, anchor them, and then crawl up the side of this hill to get a glimpse of this beautiful goddess. What this tells us is that men are no longer engaging with statues on an intellectual level, thinking about them as they had with the Doryphorus. We are not invited to walk around the Doryphorus. He's understandable only from one angle. We also need to think about the commensurability, the perfect way in which the Polyclidon style has revealed this canon in the body. We think about it. Whereas with Praxiteles and his Aphrodite of Cnidos, now we find the sensuous and humanizing qualities are applied even to the gods. This is very different from the cold and aloof gods and athletes of the high classical era that are a perfection that we cannot achieve. Now they're brought down to our level, engaging with us and speaking to us in a very human way. The same can be said for Praxiteles and his Hermes and the infant Dionysus. Two gods here, again humanizing them and showing gods behaving like average people. In this statue, we find that the messenger god Hermes happens upon the infant Dionysus in the woods and brings him to Zeus to be the twice-born god. Because we find that Dionysus will be the god of wine, the arms of these figures, though they are now missing, provide a great insight into how they would have been understood, what they were doing, how they were engaging one another. So the very sensuous S-shaped pose, a very exaggerated contrapposto, is going to find that Hermes is dangling grapes over Dionysus's head, who's going to try to play with them and try to bat at them, because of course he is going to become the god of wine. Thus this, in a very playful and very touching anecdotal way, communicates what he will be in charge of later in his adult god life. So we find that playing with a child, an infant, is certainly something that is very humanizing, very touching, and certainly would not have belonged in the classical era where we have very aloof gods. Here we find even the expression between the two is one of gentle exchange, of once again an almost paternal control and of calming as we are entertaining this infant. Now, if you compare the bodies, we can also see how Praxiteles invites our attention, appealing to our eye and our emotions, not to our mind. So whereas the Doryphorus is very hard and rigid, we find that even his hair is going to seemingly be carved on his head. The Hermes is soft and delicate. We have a type of sensuous languor here as he lifts up his arm, which is always a passively seductive pose, inviting the viewer to objectify or sensualize the subject that we are looking at here. A similar engagement can be seen with Lysippus, another very famous Greek sculptor, and his apoxymenos or scraper here. Another Roman marble copy after a bronze original, in this case from 330 BCE. Now, the apoxymenos in the Vatican collection, the Musea Vaticani, is going to interact with its environment more radically than the first two examples we just looked at. For we find that the arm radically projects forward, lifting the right arm and pointing out at the viewer in front of him. The sculpture can be seen from multiple angles, and in fact you must walk around it in order to understand what he is doing. He holds in his left hand, in fact, a strigil, because he is cleaning himself after a rigorous athletic and/or exercising event. Now, in ancient Greece, athletes, in preparing for wrestling matches and/or after they have worked out and want to get the excess dirt and/or oil off of their bodies, they pour additional oil and then use a scraper to literally scrape, exfoliate, and pull the dirt from the surface of the skin. So this is going to be something that we would all be familiar with living in ancient Greece had we just been to the gym. We would have seen a man scraping his arms, his legs, his chest, etc. In the example here, you have to look at multiple angles to even see what he is doing. For we find there is a radically foreshortened arm that points out at us. So we need to walk around to see that his left hand is scraping the rest of his underarm, and that he will then switch arms. So he is in the act of doing something mundane and very human that all of us would understand. The new canon that we also see developing in the late classical era is also much more graceful and sensual and effeminate, for it is 1/8 head lengths long instead of 1/7, the ideal canon for the Doryphorus. And whereas the Doryphorus is self-contained with ideal proportions that can be seen and appreciated at a distance, this new approach, which is a narrative one, demands that we walk around it, get close to it, and appreciate the sensuous appeal of the forms. In all of the examples cited so far, we can see that they are all in action. They are all doing something as part of a narrative, whether that be bathing in the male or female examples on either end, or playing with a child, entertaining an infant. They all are going to engage the viewer emotionally and physically, unlike classical sculpture before them. Here we have Lysippus and his weary Heracles, the statue that would bring him to the attention of Alexander the Great for its monumentality. Originally, this would have been in bronze, and so we have many of these heroic nude male forms, specifically of Heracles and Zeus. This one is going to be signed by the copyist, the Athenian sculptor Glycon of Athens. To give you an idea of scale, this 10-foot, 4-inch tall behemoth towers over humans below and is, of course, very imposing in his scale, over twice life size. So we do not relate to him necessarily by way of scale, but we do so in another way. Now we know that this was made for the Baths of Caracalla, the largest and last public works projects in the Roman Empire, in Rome itself. Now this is supposed to, like the Doryphorus, inspire vigorous exercise in whomever looked upon it. It is called the Farnese Hercules because it was owned by the Farnese family in the Renaissance and viewed in their courtyard of the family palace. We know that artists came from all over Italy to study this and copy it. It was so impressive. Like his Apoxamenos, we find that Lysippus is going to create an exaggerated S-shaped posture with an exaggerated contrapposto pose. Now, the spatial interaction is also similar, for we must move around this behemoth in order to understand at what point in the narrative we are at with Heracles. And in fact, again, this is a late classical sculpture, so we are in a stage of the narrative. Now, at 10 feet 4 inches high, we have a huge figure, but despite his rippling musculature and hypertrophied nature, and being the strongest man who ever lived, he cannot even stand up on his own. He is exhausted. He is worn out. And why, must we ask, is he worn out? Well, walking around him, we would note that he's holding apples behind his back. So we are supposed to walk around this sculpture, first to identify him with his club and lion skin that he leans on. Thus we know that this musculature belongs to Heracles. But we must walk around to know we are at the 11th labor. That is where Heracles must get the golden apples of the Hesperides. Now, this is the 11th, moving on to the 12th. Now, we know that this is a very popular story, for the Greeks represented it multiple times. Here we have a garden on the north edge of the world, guarded by the dragon Ladon or the daughters of Atlas. Either way, he's going to slay the dragon Ladon or have Atlas retrieve the apples from his daughters. He has now finished this task, either battling a dragon or holding up the sky. Either way, he's exhausted, he's worn out, he's weary, hence the name Weary Heracles. And of course, having foreknowledge of what he must do next, he would be fairly melancholic and morose. That is, in the next labor, he must actually go to hell to wrestle with a three-headed dog. But here we find that the function is the same as the Doryphorus. We are to look upon this statue, just like the Doryphorus, to inspire us to vigorous exercise. We should look like these men. We should aspire to be like them. Of course, we are never going to have the musculature of this 10-foot-tall man, but we certainly can, after a rigorous exercise routine, feel the way that he feels here, physically exhausted, aching. Right? So we find that this exaggerated musculature is not natural, it is not intellectual, it is over the top. But yet it is underscoring human tragedy, that being that he's going to be burned alive in order to regain his place and return to Mount Olympus with his father. No longer in the same labor as we looked at before do we find that the figures are calm and serene, noble and detached. Now we see the pain in his eyes. We are affected by the pathos of the figure, being very concerned for his well-being, feeling, of course, what he feels, knowing that a hero is a consummate sufferer. Now we find that we no longer have the serene expression. We find that he is dejected, exhausted. And this interest in humanizing the gods is what is so popular in the late classical era. We make them relatable. We show them as humans, suffering and feeling as we do. Because of statues like the Weary Heracles, Lysippus is going to come to the attention of Alexander the Great and be the only sculptor allowed to and sanctioned to produce official portraits of the king. He produces, we know, at least one full-length bronze with Alexander the Great holding a lance. Plutarch, the Roman historian, tells us that on the base was inscribed, quote, "I place the earth under my sway. You, O Zeus, keep Olympus," end quote. A very bold statement, as we find that Alexander the Great challenges the king of the gods himself directly. Looking upward, here is a copy of the head that probably looked like what the original face would have. Looking up to the sky, mouth parted as though he is speaking, and then we can see what he is saying inscribed below. The original format we have several examples of from Hellenistic rulers throughout the period to follow Alexander the Great's death. And so we would have had a massive spear, this bronze nude, heroic nudity on the scale of a god or a demigod, looking up to the heavens, very daring and engaging. Obviously, we walk around it. He is in the act of doing something. He is talking. He's challenging the gods themselves. Turning to Virginia and Macedonia, an area controlled by Alexander the Great and his father before him, we have an example of something that is very rare in antiquity, and that is painting. Most paintings do not survive from ancient Greece or from ancient Egypt unless they are in tombs, and that is exactly the case that we find here in Virginia. Here we find in a tomb a painting on the wall of Hades abducting Persephone. Now, in this small painting, very rare indeed, we have an image of a god who is rarely ever depicted. For to depict him or even say his name is to invite death on you and your family. The god of the underworld, Hades himself. In the painting that you see here, a figure runs off to the left as a two-horse chariot charges out into the viewer's space, carrying on it Hades driving the chariot and Persephone, who is nude with a pink bit of drapery that's billowing behind her, while her mother Demeter cowers in the lower right-hand corner. The story of Hades and Persephone is very important to the ancient Greeks, for it explains not only what happens in the underworld, but the etiological myth that explains the seasons. For Hades spies Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, the goddess in charge of the harvest and bringing back life every spring. He then kidnaps, abducts Persephone to be his queen in the underworld. Her mother is so sad that she lets the earth die, and with it humans begin to die. Zeus then pleads with his brother Hades to return Persephone so that humans can live and we can pray to the gods and sacrifice to them. We find that Hades, in this instance, is going to trick Persephone into eating pomegranate seeds, and she must return to the underworld for 1 month for each seed that she ate. Hence we have the time in the year that her mother is sad, for her daughter is taken to the underworld, and the rest of the year, spring, summer, and fall, when she's going to be returned to her mother. In this instance, which is appropriate for someone who is young and taken before their time as well, we have Hades, shown like Zeus and Poseidon, his other two brothers, but with shaggier hair, unkempt hair. He grabs onto the breast of Persephone, an image in antiquity and the early modern era implying ownership of a woman. We find that he is radically foreshortened, coming out at us as he turns back to look at Persephone's mother Demeter crying off in the corner. Now, the foreshortening and interest in it began with vase painting and then transitioned into sculpture. But what it allows you to do is engage directly with the viewer, that he's literally coming out at us, so we must consider physically what is happening in the scene and physically how they're going to be relating to us, because we must move out of the way of the horses. And just like we are in a tomb with a corpse as well, they are also showing us that they are taken and dragged into the underworld before their time. Now, rushing into the viewer's space with this dramatic interaction, we're using the same techniques that other late classical painters, sculptors, and others had used, like Lysippus, dramatically moving into our space, foreshortened out at us. This is going to force a type of direct engagement and interaction that would be used later on in the Baroque era by Bernini in his painting and or sculpture of the same scene, whereby Pluto, or Hades, the god of the underworld, drags Persephone across the threshold. She is now in the underworld. Now, we will find that this is going to be common in images relating to the battles of Alexander the Great as well, where we find that foreshortened horses and or spears are going to relate the dramatic action, the dramatic tension and loud cacophony of sound and of clashing of soldiers here. In the same way, it is not logical. This is a physical gut reaction that we have in looking at this painting, a very emotive and evocative one. So in the late classical period, we have this sensuous appeal to the viewer's senses. We engage the viewer physically and emotionally instead of intellectually. And this corresponds with a period where the Greeks are going to lose faith in their ability to control and understand their world. Next time, we will continue on by discussing the Hellenistic period and what happens after the death of Alexander the Great, when we find that this emotional style will be sent to and commissioned in all corners of the known world in the West, in the largest empire that the world has known, the Hellenistic one.